Well, my name is Joseph Shulam, and I'm continuing the study of the books of Samuel. We finished the book of 1 Samuel, and we're starting the book of 2 Samuel now. And as I said before, these books were divided into 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, because of their size and because people wrote these things on scrolls, on leather. Leather gets heavy, and such a long book of so many chapters required that they divided into smaller sections, and so they did divide. And when we start reading 2 Samuel, I'll go to English, to New King James. We are repeating the last half of the last chapter of 1 Samuel, essentially almost word for word. And that is to reconnect the two scrolls, that you see that it is a continuity. And it starts with a formula. Now it came to pass after the death of Saul. This is the formula. It's a formula that appears in Genesis. In Genesis 25, for example, we find the same formula. I will change from the Hebrew to the English script there, and you will see. And it came to pass, exactly the same word, after the death of Abraham, that God blessed his son Isaac. And that formula appears in the book of Judges and in many of the books of the Bible, where somebody dies, a king dies, somebody important dies, and the formula is, and it came to pass after the death of, which is a biblical pattern. So David, we hear the same story as at the end of 1 Samuel. David chased the Amalekites that had captured Ziklag and taken people as slaves, including David's two wives, and they took the booty and they killed the men that were left there. So David comes back. He's not accepted by Avner ben Ner. He's not accepted to join the battle against the Philistines. Fortunately, he's not accepted. The Philistines win the war against Saul and his army in a big way, kill all of Saul's sons, and then finally Saul kills himself. And now we're returning to the beginning of 2 Samuel, the same story. A messenger comes, and he's not an Israelite, he's a servant, but he's not an Israelite. And he comes and David asks him, where do you come from? He says, I escaped from the camp of Israel. David asked him again, how did the matter go? How did the war go? Please tell me. The people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen dead, and Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also. In 1 Samuel, the end of 1 Samuel, it says all the sons of Saul are dead. So David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead? Then the young man who told him said this, as I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear. The spear, the sword, is a translation issue. The translators do the Septuagint, and then the translators from the Greek translation of the text to English and other countries, other languages, they variated from sword to spear. In Hebrew, it could be either way. And indeed, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. Now when he looked behind him, he saw me and called me. And I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? So I answered him, I am an Amalekite. He said to me again, please stand over me and kill me, for anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me. So I stood over him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord. Now there is discrepancies between what this Amalekite servant said in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel to what he's saying here in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. The discrepancy here, he takes credit here for killing King Saul. By King Saul's request, what's called a mercy killing. But if I go back to 1 Samuel, then the report is a little bit different. Yeah. There, Saul falls himself on his sword, and he kills himself. Here, because this Amalekite knows that Saul was an enemy of King David and he wanted to kill him, he's trying to get credit for something that he shouldn't be getting credit for, and he'll pay for it. Here in the Philistines had killed all three sons of Saul, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and trust me with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took the sword and fell on it. And when the armor bearer saw Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. In other words, Saul's armor bearer did not kill Saul. Saul killed himself, according to this story. Now this Amalekite comes from the battle and runs to David, and he thinks that because Saul was trying to kill David and was his enemy, that he's going to get some benefit from David. So he says, "I killed Saul. Saul asked me, and I knew he was going to die anyway, so I killed him." That's the end of 1 Samuel. Now in 2 Samuel, this guy arrives to David and tells him a different story. He says, he asked me to kill him and I killed him. Now here is the big question from the point of view of the narrative, of the writer of this. The writer knew both stories. I believe it's the same writer. He knew that Saul had fallen on his own sword and killed himself. But now he's telling the story that this Amalekite is telling David. And the outcome of it is that David pulls out his sword and delivers this Amalekite from his head. He had just come back from a battle against the Amalekite, in which he also killed many Amalekites there. So one more Amalekite, gratis. But he lied to David, and David apparently knew that he's lying, and that he's taking credit for something that he didn't do. Verse 11 of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. Therefore David took hold of his own clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Here is a tiny drop of exposing David's real character. You know, David was a manipulator, there's no doubt of that. And he was not always sincere, there's no doubt of that. And he sinned almost all the 10 commandments, except 2 commandments, or even 1 commandment. David sinned 9 out of the 10 commandments. He was a rascal. Yes, he was. He was a rascal. But he was also a great man. Great man. Great man, and I would say great man of God. And God himself said that David was. So I'm not exaggerating or anything. But here is a David that had chance to kill Saul several times in the cave of En-Gedi, and then when he took his basin for washing his face, and his spear, and right out from next to his head in his tent during the night, David could have killed Saul. But his idea was, Saul is the anointed one of God, Mashiach Adonai. And you don't touch Mashiach Adonai. Even if he wants to kill you, you don't touch him. That aspect of David's kingship, that piece of righteousness in his character, is, I think, why God loved him. Yeah, he made mistakes, but he repented. Unlike Herod, when Nathan came to David and said about Bathsheba, you know, the parable of the poor man with the 1 lamb. The rich man that had many lambs, and he takes the poor man's lamb and he slaughters it to feed his guests. Same story, just a different way of delivering the message that John the Baptist said to Herod the Great. But John the Baptist blurted it out, boom. And Herod the Great was not David. And he allowed the women to make the decision, and they got John the Baptist's head. David is not Herod the Great. He repents for his sins. When he's confronted with his sin by God or by the prophet or by the priest or even by his own men, he repents. That's very big. So he does the same things that Jews do today. When they start, after the burial of the dead, when they start, or before the burial of the dead, when they start their mourning period, they tear their clothes. Today a rabbi comes with a razor blade or a Japanese knife, slits your shirt or your t-shirt or sweater, whatever you're wearing, men and women, and you're not supposed to take a bath for 7 days, and you're not supposed to change these clothes, these mourning clothes, for 7 days. So David tears his clothes, and his officers, the ones who are next to him, do the same thing. They tear their clothes. And they mourn for Saul and Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord's house, the house of Israel, that had fallen in the battle. at the hands of the Philistines. Yeah. But he doesn't spare that lying Amalekite. He cuts his head off. Actually, he doesn't do it. It's in verse 15 of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. It's very interesting. David called one of the young men and said, "Go near and execute him." And he struck him so that he died. So David said to him, "Your blood is on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." Which means that David knew that he didn't kill the Lord's anointed. But he lied. He took credit for it. And David says, your own mouth has condemned you. You claim you did it, you're going to pay for it. David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. And he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of bowing down. Indeed, it is written in the book of Yashar. This book of Yashar issue is a big issue. It's a very big issue. And maybe later, on another occasion, I'll get deeper into it. We don't have the book of Yashar. Anybody who claims that he has the book of Yashar is lying. I wish we find it. I wish our archaeologists find it. If it exists in the Vatican Library, there's a lot of treasures in the Vatican Library we don't know where they are, if they're there or not. But they could be there. Could be there. So the book of Yashar is mentioned in Joshua. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 12 and 13, when Joshua battles the 5 Canaanite kings and says, "Let the sun stand still over Gibeon and the moon over Ayalon," and continues the battle. The Lord lengthens the day, the sun, the daylight, so that Joshua and his men could continue the battle against the coalition of 5 Canaanite kings. The head of that coalition was the king of Gezer. Tel Gezer. Yeah. And also it's mentioned that's in Joshua 10. Then it's mentioned again in 1 Kings 8, and in context of Solomon. Am I right? Am I wrong? No, it's not mentioned there, but it is mentioned in just a minute, let me see. It's mentioned more than once. The book of Yashar. Let's see, 1 Kings 8, 53. No, also not. Okay, so we'll talk about the book of Yashar on another occasion. And here comes one of the most beautiful laments that King David says for King Saul and his son Jonathan. I wish you knew Hebrew, and I would read it in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's absolutely stunning. We all learned it in Hebrew in elementary school by heart, together with the Song of Moses from Exodus 15 and the Song of Deborah from Judges chapter 5 and some other such epic poems in the Bible. But I'm going to read it for you in English. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. The beauty of Israel means King Saul and Jonathan. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it nothing Gath, one of the big Philistine cities. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, another one of the 5 Philistine cities. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. O mountain of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For the shield of the mighty is cast away there, is fallen down there. The shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. That's another issue of translation. The shield of Saul, who was anointed with oil, for the blood of the slain, for the fat of the mighty. The bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not turn empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughter of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlets with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. That's the end of that wonderful lament. But there are some issues in this wonderful lament that I want to mention, especially in our own day. And I have to tell you a story about verse 26 in chapter 1. I'm going to read it again in the New King James Version. I am distressed for you, O my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. You loved me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. Well, I'll tell you a personal story. We had here in Jerusalem for several years, I think about 5 or 6 years, a young man from Cyprus. His name was Mike. His brother-in-law was the preacher in Crete and also worked at the Greek Airlines. His mother was a wonderful sister. His brother married an American teacher, professor of Bible, also a wonderful family. And Mike was a very bright student at the Hebrew University. And he decided to go and do his doctorate at the University of Chicago. I begged him not to go there. I told him, Mike, it's not a good school, very liberal theologically, and there are professors of Bible there that are not good people, not moral people. Look, the same thing was at David Lipscomb College when I was a student there. There was the dean, who was also a teacher of Bible and also a preacher in a big church in Nashville, Tennessee, that also was the same thing. He was also gay, and he made several classmates of mine fall. Most of them have recuperated and refocused their moral fiber to a more biblical lifestyle with God's help and the Holy Spirit's help. But anyway, so Mike went to Chicago and got infected by a very famous scholar, Morton Enslin Smith, at the University of Chicago, and became gay. And I went together with several preachers, Elmer Morgan and another dear brother, his name escapes me now, that was a missionary in Italy, Keith Robinson. I went the first time with Elmer Morgan to visit he had moved from Chicago, left the doctorate, moved from Chicago to Dallas, and he was like an architectural photographer. That's how he made his living, and he lived in an abandoned, a building that used to be an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. So we visited him to talk to him, and he brought this verse from David's lament for Saul and Jonathan, where David says in verse 20, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. And they was trying to justify that it's okay with the Bible to be gay. Well, we tried to, both I and Elmer and Keith Robinson, we tried. I tried 3 times. And I liked Mike. And I like his family. And I like his family that still lives today. I think his mother has passed away, but his sister is still alive. I think they still live in Abilene. Not sure. Florida or Abilene. I told Mike all the 3 times, it's not a prophecy. It's just looking to where the wind blows. I told him, Mike, you are going to die from AIDS. And when you get AIDS, you are going to look for me all over the world to find me, to talk to me. You're not going to find me before you die. That's what happened. But using this verse to say that the Bible approves that King David was gay, it's preposterous. It's not true. David was a womanizer, okay. We have good records of that. He had, in his lifetime, he had 13 wives, 13 women. Some of them were political marriages with the king of the Golan Heights of Geshur. The Canaanite king of the Golan Heights, he married his daughter to make a peace pact so he doesn't have to go up there and fight. So, but David was no gay, no homosexual. And it's possible for a person to say, yes, I love you, my dear friend, surpassing the love of women. But it doesn't mean he made love with him. And to take this verse and to make David gay is absolutely preposterous. He had no reason to be gay. He was married to beautiful women, to fine women, made children with the fine women. And we have, other than this verse, we have no clue, other than very deep and sincere friendship with Jonathan, that David was a gay person in any way, shape, or form. And I don't believe that. And I hope that none of you believe that. So this lament is very famous. The text that speaks to me about David, and that I love this text, is the text earlier in the lament, where he says something that is very, very important. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Al tagidu beGath, ve'al tevasru bechutzot Ashkelon. That the Hebrew of this text is genius. Yes, not plishtim, blot arelim. Yeah, this is something that we need to be more careful in Israel, and I think that we are, unlike other nations in this. We don't rejoice when our enemy falls. When terrorists, terrible terrorists that have killed Jews, that have bombed, that have sent others to blow up in buses, that have kidnapped airplanes, when they die, we don't rejoice. We don't. I mean, we also don't go put sackcloth and ashes on our head that our enemies, that our terrorists, international terrorists died. No. But we don't rejoice, because there is inbred in us from the Word of God, from the law, the Torah, not to rejoice in other people's fall. Because today you are up and they're down. Tomorrow you could be down and somebody else could rejoice over you. And David here is showing his character. He doesn't want the bad news of Israel to bring joy to our enemies. But when our enemies kill our soldiers, our boys, our women, our children, babies in their cribs, they throw a party. They have a tent. They give candy and sweets, baklawa, burma, knafe, with coffee, celebrating on the rooftops that some Israeli got killed, that some officer got shot. That's in the Middle East. That practice is still there. And David says, don't advertise your sorrow for King Saul among the Philistines, among our enemies, lest their daughters start dancing and rejoicing, and lest their men, their uncircumcised men, the Gentile Philistines, a cruel nation, rejoice. And he says that no dew and no rain will fall on Mount Gilboa. Gilboa is essentially barren until today. There are some beautiful flowers that bloom there in the springtime. Yeah, wonderful. You know, flowers, irises, huge Gilboa irises like this. Huge, beautiful, but there's no way to raise crops there. It's not enough. So this is chapter 1, and I will see if I should go into chapter 2. Verse 1 at least. It happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. David says, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. Now, here is David. He has been now for more than 20 years running away from King Saul. King Saul has chased him in the desert, in the mountains, in Judea, on the east side, on the west side. He finally had to run away to the enemies of Israel, to the Philistines, to the city of Gath, to Achish, the king of Gath. He had to go there. How low his morale must have been. But in order to survive, not only as David, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem, that killed Goliath, that was from Gath, but David, who's been anointed by Samuel to be the king of Israel. The simplest question. Saul is dead. There is no king in Israel. And they say, the king is dead, let the new king take power. No. He says, God, shall I go now to Judah and claim the throne? There's nobody to inherit Saul. He's got one crippled son, Mephibosheth, that is alive, but he's not capable of becoming a king or ruling. But David still, he knows Saul is dead, he knows Jonathan is dead, he knows that the other two sons of Saul are dead that are capable, and he asks God, shall I go up to the cities of Judah? Shall I go up and claim what you have given me so many years ago, more than 20 years before? And he gets an answer from God. Go up. And David says, where should I go? He says, go to Hebron. And when David went there with two of his wives, the wives that the Amalekites captured, and he went and captured them back from the Amalekites. Achinoam the Jezreelite, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household. In other words, when they ran from Saul, they ran with their families to Ziklag, a Judean city that the Philistines had captured. And the men of David, with their families, with their households, so they dwell in the city of Hebron. They go to Hebron, the capital of Judea, on the high mountains, higher than Jerusalem, south of Jerusalem, the city where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Sarah, Leah are buried. Rebecca, buried there in the cave that Abraham bought from the Hittite, from the Hittite. But what touches me here is this. Being a military man anywhere, anytime, even in the 21st century, the family is how should I say, has to move from here to there, from there to here. The life of an officer even in the Israeli army or in the American army is not easy for the family. Maybe easier for the man who is in uniform than his own family. But we see here a very unique thing. It's not like the Roman legions in the time of Yeshua, that the men traveled alone, left their families wherever they are. Only when they retired, if they were lucky, they could get their families back. Or if they're back at leave in Italy, in Rome, or in somewhere else around there where they come from, they could join their armies, their families. No, the men, David takes his wives with him, his family with him, and his men take their household, their families with them, and they dwell in Hebron. And that, people don't pay attention to these little things. But I think it's very important to see. It shows the character of David. who he really was. He was not only somebody who wants to be the king, who's been anointed by God to be the king, and who believes in claiming that anointing by Samuel the prophet to be the king of Israel. But he has, some values that are very, very high and important and unusual in that world, in that circumstance. The men of Judah came and they anointed David king over the house of Judah, and they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul, because Saul went and saved the honor of the men of Jabesh Gilead after they had their left eye taken out and their beards shaved. So the men of Jabesh Gilead, we read it in 1 Samuel, honored Saul enough. They went and took his head and his body off the walls of Beit Shan, and they buried them, a proper Israelite burial. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you this kindness, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strengthened, and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over you. Here again, a short window, a glimpse into the character of David. David is in Hebron, south of Israel, north of the Negev, at the end of the central mountain range, at the tip of the patriarchal highway that goes from Judea, from the Negev desert to the Galilee. And he sends a message to the people of Jabesh Gilead for the good deed that they did, and he commands them for what they did, and he announces them that now he has been crowned as king of Israel. And not over Judea only, but over all of Israel, including Jabesh Gilead on the other side of the Jordan, north, straight east from the city of Beit Shan. But Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead. Mahanaim is mentioned in the book of Genesis. That's when Jacob returns from 21 years at Laban with Rachel and Leah as his wives, and he splits his camp, afraid of Esau. He splits his camp in a place called the Two Camps, Mahanaim. That's the place. So he takes Mephibosheth, who was crippled and incapable of being king, and Abner, the son of Ner, makes him a king over Gilead, over the Ashurites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. David sent them a message to the people of Jabesh Gilead that he's been anointed by the people of Judah as king, but Abner ben Ner, the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, takes this crippled, unfit person, the last king of Saul, and anoints him as king over all Israel, over the Gilead, over the Asherites, over the Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, over all Israel. And Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Okay? So we have now a situation of two kings. One that God anointed by Samuel the prophet, even while Saul was still alive and the king of Israel. And we have Ishbosheth, son of Saul, crowned by Abner, the son of Ner, as king over all of Israel. David now is only king over Judah from Hebron, not over all of Israel. Now the name Ishbosheth is an interesting name. His original name was Ishbaal. The theophoric name, not of Yah, not of El, not of the God of Israel, but of Baal. I imagine that King Saul would have given him that name because syncretism was rampant. We know that from the archaeology, like it is today. It is today in some branches of Orthodox Judaism. It is today in many branches of evangelical and Protestant Christianity. I'm not even including the Greek Orthodox or the Catholic Church or the Coptic Church or the Armenian Church or the Egyptian or the Ethiopian Church. I'm not including these churches or the church in Brazil that is openly syncretistic. And the Catholic priest worship the God, the Father of Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ, but mainly Maria, but also the goddess of the sea that the African slaves that were taken to Brazil brought with them, and the Black Madonna, which is another issue, but idols are rampant. Christianity is not cleared from idolatry in most of its branches. But the same situation was there in the days of Israel, the days of David and after David and the prophets. That's what the prophets barked so much about. What did they bark about? They barked about the fact that Israel is worshiping idols and abandoning Jehovah, abandoning the God who created the heavens and the earth. I don't know of any famous television evangelist or any famous pastor that spoke about the syncretism that exists in Christianity, the intake and the cooperation and the worship that is a mishmash, a mixture of light and darkness, of truth and lies, of worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and idolatry at the same time. Not only in the substance, but also in the form. But that was the situation. Saul's son was called Ishbaal, and in the mouth of David, in the text of David, he's called Ishbosheth. Bosheth means one or two things: shamefulness, or the shameful parts of a woman. Not the shameful parts of a woman. Excuse me, I apologize, I take it back. But the private parts of a woman. That's what this name of the last son of Saul is, at least in the text of 2 Samuel. And Joab, the son of Truiah. Now Abner, the son of Ner, is the chief of staff of Saul's army. Joab, the son of Truiah, was the chief of staff of David's army. went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon, not far from Jerusalem, northwest of Jerusalem. Gibeon still exists. El Jib, that's the Arabic name of the village. No longer a village, it's a suburb of Jerusalem with luxury buildings, private villas, palaces built by the Palestinian that live here near Jerusalem. I went there with Marcia and the children and with some guests so many times before the Palestinians got rich and built. In the old Tel mound that had the old Gibeon there, the Gibeonite that lied to Joshua and said, we came from far, bread and the clothes and the sandals, and they were very close to Joshua. Joshua swallowed the lie and lived with it, and supposedly made them carriers of water and hewers of wood. But the Palestinians, was a very poor village, without electricity, without running water. They were drinking from the same well that was from the time of the patriarchs in Gibeon in the 1960s, after the 6-Day War, and in the early 70s. Now it is luxury, big luxury. They made the money by being good builders, good workers, building the Jewish neighborhoods, building the Jewish houses. They built the house I live. Palestinian Arabs, the contractor was Jewish, Orthodox Jewish, but the Palestinian Arabs built the buildings here and in most of the land of Israel. The Jews were not born to be simple workers. They were born to be directors, and they are still the directors, but the people who actually do the physical work are Palestinians, and they're good at it. They're good at it. Most of the time, they're very good at it. So Joab meets, the text doesn't say clearly, in the pool of Gibeon, Abner, son of Ner, and the men that are left of the army of Saul, meets with the chief of staff of Saul, Abner the son of Ner, meet with the chief of staff of David, Joab the son of Tzruiah, and they go to Gibeon, and they meet in the pool of Gibeon, which still existed. I haven't been there because it's a little bit hostile place to be for Israelis and Jews to be there, but it was not hostile when they were poor and lived in buildings that were built 1,000 years earlier by Crusaders and by Muslims, without electricity and without running water. That's when we visited them in the late 60s and early 70s. So they meet there in this pool, in this hole that still, I think it still exists. I hope it still exists. I think I have pictures, photographs of it, of this place that this is talking about. Then Abner said to Joab, let the young men now rise and compete before us. In other words, they're now in a pit. The generals and the officers are sitting in the top, and they send their men like gladiators to fight in front of them to kill each other. And Joab said to Abner said to Joab, let the young men now arise and compete before us. And Joab said, let them arise. So they arose and went over by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 servants of David. And each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Therefore, that place was called the field of sharp sword, which is in Gibeon, the field of sharp sword that is in Gibeon. The Hebrew word for soldiers, that is translated soldiers, opponents, It's the boys. Hanarim, the boys, the young men. It was a strange situation. 12 men from each side, like in the days of the knights in Europe, in medieval Europe, like the jousting. 12 men go downstairs, each one with his sword. They slaughtered each other. The 24 of them died. David knows nothing about that. So the place is called the Field of Sharp Sword in Gibeon. So there was very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now the three sons of Zeruiah were there: Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as fleet of foot as a wild gazelle. So Asahel pursued Abner. And in going, he did not turn to the right hand or to the left hand from following Abner. And then Abner looked behind him and said, "Are you Asahel?" He said, "I am." And Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left hand, and lay hold on one of your young men, and take his armor for yourself." But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. So Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab?" However, he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear. So the spear came out of his back, and he fell down there and died on the spot. So it was that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down, died, stood still. Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner, and the sun was going down when they came to the hill of Ammah, which is before Giah, by the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. Now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became a unit, and took their stand on top of the hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be then until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" And Joab said, verse 27 of chapter 2, "As God lives, unless you have spoken, surely then by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the people stood still, and it did not pursue Israel anymore, nor did they fight anymore. And Abner and his men went on all that night through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through all Bithron, and came to Machanaim. So Joab returned from pursuing Abner. When he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 90 men and Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360 who died. Then they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all that night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. The end of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel. This event at the pool of Gibeon stands in David's mind as a dark moment of his military career. that Joab initiated together with Abner the son of Ner, trying to save the honor of King Saul and to save the kingship of Ishbosheth, which they couldn't. We're going to continue to chapter 3, the next lesson. Please read it and enjoy it. Read it slowly and enjoy it. How should I say? These first chapters of 2 Samuel are like a prologue. They're like an introduction to the problems in David's administration in the future. And in David's relationship with Joab, his chief of staff, in the future, which in the end Joab kills Absalom, David's son, and there is another great lament by King David. Yep. So may God have mercy on all of us, protect us and our families and our brothers and our sisters around the world from the coronavirus and any illness, and give us the joy of the Lord and make it our strength. In Yeshua's name, amen.